Korean mafia boss speaks Korean to humiliate a black female bodyguard. He freezes when she replied. Nobody warned the lion that the woman walking through his door had already survived 3 attempts on her life, 2 collapsed governments, and 1 absolutely catastrophic first date in Nairobi that she still refused to discuss. If they had, Kang Han-sol might have reconsidered. But arrogance, much like a gas leak, is invisible right up until everything explodes. If you've ever been underestimated, talked down to, or dismissed by someone who assumed you couldn't understand their world, this story is yours. Hit like, subscribe, and stay locked in. Because what Simone does next will make you want to stand up and clap. Let's get into it. The body that arrived at Seoul's Incheon International Airport on a gray, indifferent Tuesday morning in October did not look like a weapon. That was, of course, entirely the point. Simone, the shadow, Reed stood 6 feet tall in flat shoes, a personal choice, because heels were inefficient, and she had once chased a gunman 17 blocks in stilettos in Johannesburg and sworn a solemn, profane oath to never repeat the experience. She wore black tactical trousers, a fitted white shirt, and a calm so absolute it bordered on meteorological. People moved out of her way in the arrivals hall without understanding why. It was muscle memory for the human race, the deep, prehistoric instinct that whispers that one is dangerous before the conscious mind has finished forming the thought. She collected her single bag, ignored the driver holding a sign with her name misspelled in 2 languages, and walked directly to the second driver, the one with no sign, standing near the pillar, who Theo had told her would be there. He was a thin man in his 50s with watchful eyes and the energy of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. "You're late," he said in Korean. "You're obvious," she replied in the same language, nodding toward the earpiece he'd failed to properly conceal. He blinked. She walked past him to the car. It was going to be that kind of job. Seoul received her the way expensive cities receive strangers who cannot be easily categorized, with beauty, chaos, and a low hum of menace that passed for ambient noise. The Han River glittered to her left as the car moved through Gangnam, neon bleeding into wet pavement, the city stacking itself in layers of glass and light, and the very specific kind of organized crime that wears cufflinks and attends charity galas. Simone watched it all with the focused disinterest of a chess player studying a board she hadn't yet decided to destroy. She reviewed what she knew. Kang Han-sol, 41, head of the Northern Syndicates, worth more money than several small nations, all of it traceable to 17 legitimate businesses that served as the world's most elegantly dressed laundromat. Ruthless, precise, pathologically composed. The kind of man who had once reportedly sat through an assassination attempt, straightened his tie afterward, and continued his dinner, though Simone suspected that story had been embellished in the retelling because human beings cannot resist mythology, especially when it involves a well-dressed villain. 37 protection specialists had preceded her in this role. She had read every single file. 36 had been dismissed, some violently, some not, one apparently after Kang found their chewing during a meeting spiritually offensive. The 37th, as Theo had so delicately communicated, now communicated exclusively on Tuesdays and in whispers. His file had been the most illuminating, not because of what happened to him, but because of when. 3 weeks in, right after he'd apparently gotten too close to understanding something he wasn't supposed to understand. Simone had noted the timing. She noted everything. Kang's compound in northern Gangnam was the architectural equivalent of a polished threat. All clean lines and restraint. The kind of building that said, "I have nothing to hide," in the same tone a man uses when he very much has something to hide. The lobby was marble and silence, staffed by 3 men whose suits were tailored and whose eyes were calculating, and whose collective body language communicated, with remarkable efficiency, that they were not the welcome committee. The one nearest the elevator looked her up and down in a manner that was professionally insulting. Simone had seen that look on 4 continents. It was the look that said, "You are an anomaly here, and anomalies make us nervous, so we will diminish you before you can confuse us further." It was a look she had long since stopped taking personally, mostly because people who looked at her that way had a habit of looking considerably different at her by the end of any given story. She smiled, just slightly, the way a knife catches light. He looked away first. Kang Han-sol, when she finally met him in the cold geometry of his private office, was exactly what his file had prepared her for, and somehow, irritatingly, still more. He sat behind a desk that probably cost more than Theo's entire annual salary, dressed in charcoal so perfectly fitted, it seemed structural. His face was all sharp angles and controlled expression, handsome in the way that certain dangerous things are handsome, the way storm systems are handsome, impressive and indifferent to the damage they cause. He did not stand when she entered. He did not offer his hand. He looked at her with the slow, assessing patience of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use it to make her feel she had none. "Ms. Reed," he said, in perfect English, his accent precise and deliberate. "You come highly recommended." "Most weapons do," she replied. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in his expression. Not offense, not amusement. Something colder and more interesting. Recalibration. He had expected deference. He had received geometry. He didn't know what to do with that yet, so he filed it away with the smooth efficiency of a man who processed unexpected variables by waiting to see what they did next. "You will shadow me," he said, the faintest edge of mockery in the word shadow, as though the irony of her nickname amused him in a way he would not dignify with a smile. "You will not speak unless spoken to in professional settings. You will not question my decisions. You will not attempt to do the job you're paying me for," Simone said pleasantly. The silence that followed had texture. Kang looked at her for a long, measured moment. Then he returned to the papers on his desk and said simply, "Welcome to Seoul, Miss Reed. Try not to become number 38. Simone stood in the middle of his expensive, dangerous, immaculate office and thought about the mole, about the surgical leaks, about the Southern Collective, and the man called Beck, who moved like geology and struck like an earthquake. She thought about the 37 files, about timing, about patterns, and she thought, he has no idea what he just let through his front door. Outside, Seoul hummed its neon hymn. Inside, the Ice King returned to his papers, confident in his empire, comfortable in his contempt. The Panther had arrived. She was not yet ready to show her teeth. There is a particular kind of disrespect that wears a suit. It doesn't shout. It doesn't swing. It arrives quietly, dressed in assumption and cologne. And it sits across from you at expensive tables and speaks in languages it believes you cannot understand. And it smiles. God, it smiles. The way people smile at decorative things that exist purely for aesthetic purposes and have no interior life worth consulting. Kang Han-sol had perfected this particular brand of disrespect the way other men perfected golf swings, through dedicated practice, natural talent, and a complete absence of consequences. Simone had been in Seoul for exactly 9 days when she began to understand, with clinical certainty, that the Ice King did not see her as a person. He saw her as a feature, an expensive, exotic, vaguely impressive feature, like the abstract sculpture in his lobby that everyone acknowledged and nobody touched. She was the American exhibit, present, notable, and fundamentally decorative in his estimation. She found this useful. The mornings followed a pattern so rigid, it was almost artistic in its inflexibility. Kang rose at 5:15. He trained for 45 minutes in a private gym that occupied the entire east wing of his compound, not because he feared physical confrontation, but because discipline was his religion, and the gym was simply one of its cathedrals. He ate breakfast alone at a table set for 8, which Simone privately thought was the saddest thing she had seen since her third deployment. He reviewed communications between 6:30 and 7. By 7:45, the car was moving. Simone shadowed every step, 2 paces behind, slightly to the left. Eyes forward, but peripheral vision operating at full capacity, cataloging everything. Exits, angles, faces, hands. Always hands. Hands told you more than faces ever did because people learned to control their faces young. But hands betrayed everything. A tightened grip. A thumb working the inside of a palm. Fingers that drummed a rhythm, 2 beats too fast. Hands were honest. Simone trusted hands. What she did not trust, increasingly, was a lieutenant named Park Sung-jin. Park was Kang's second. Lean, quick-eyed, immaculately presented, and possessed of the specific nervous energy of a man carrying something heavy in a pocket he kept checking to make sure was still zipped. He had been with Kang for 6 years. which in syndicate mathematics translated to an almost geological level of trust. He was funny in the loose, easy way that charming people weaponize. Always the first to laugh at Kang's remarks. Always present at the precise center of every inner circle conversation. He was also, Simone noted, the only person in Kang's orbit whose hands were never still. She had first clocked it on day 3, a Thursday morning briefing, where Kang outlined the week's movements with his characteristic economy of words. While every other lieutenant in that room sat with the disciplined stillness of men trained to project composure, Park's left thumb moved in small, repetitive circles against his thigh. Slow, rhythmic, the physical equivalent of a lie whispering to itself. Simone filed it, said nothing, watched harder. The social architecture of Kang's inner circle was, she had to admit, impressive in its dysfunction. There were 7 lieutenants total, each governing a specific operational territory with the kind of fierce territorial pride that made Simone think of middle management everywhere. Men who had exchanged their individuality for proximity to power and convinced themselves this was the same as having power. They tolerated each other with the strained collegiality of people who shared a lifeboat and hadn't yet decided who to throw overboard. They did not tolerate Simone at all. She was, in their collective assessment, an affront to the natural order. A foreign woman installed above their heads, answering directly to Kang, protected by a contract whose terms they were not privileged to know. They expressed this intolerance the way men in suits typically do, not with confrontation, but with exclusion. Conversations that stopped a beat too late when she entered rooms. Briefings summarized for her in English so clipped and incomplete they bordered on parody. Jokes in Korean that landed like stones into the polite fiction that she understood nothing. She understood everything. Every word. Every inference. Every carefully constructed slight dressed up as a cultural barrier. She let them believe otherwise, because a woman who appears not to understand is a woman no one bothers to deceive carefully. And careless deception was Simone's favorite kind. It left the most evidence. It was on day 9 that the testing began in earnest. Kang had a dinner meeting at a private restaurant in Itaewon. The kind of establishment that had no visible signage, accepted no reservations through conventional channels, and whose kitchen reportedly used ingredients flown in from 4 countries because that was simply the standard Kang's associates expected. Simone rode in the second car, scanned the perimeter on arrival, confirmed the interior with the contacts she had quietly established at Seoul's National Intelligence Service, a favor she had banked 3 years prior during her Special Forces embedding and was now very calmly collecting. The restaurant was clean. The dinner was not. Midway through the second course, Kang turned to his lieutenants and began speaking in the archaic, elite dialect, the one designed as a verbal velvet rope between the powerful and everyone beneath them. His voice was low and almost theatrical, and his eyes moved to Simone with the lazy confidence of a man who had never once been surprised by a foreigner. "She sits there like a general," he said, "but she has never fought our wars. She eats at our table, but cannot taste our salt. A shadow without a body. A gun without a trigger. Tell me, does anyone else find it exhausting importing decorations from New York?" The table rippled with quiet laughter. Simone sat still. Her face was a closed door. Her eyes remained forward. She picked up her water glass and took a slow, composed sip, and thought. Park's left hand just moved to his jacket pocket. 3rd time in 20 minutes. Checking his phone. But his phone hasn't vibrated. He's waiting for a signal. She noted the time. She noted the exit nearest Park's chair. She noted that the laughter around the table had that particular, performative quality of men laughing, not because something was funny, but because the most powerful person in the room had decided it was. Then she set her glass down, looked at nothing, and quietly decided that Kang Han-sol had approximately 72 hours before his carefully constructed world began to come apart at the seams. She would hold it together, naturally. But first, she was going to let him finish his dinner. He deserved at least that much before everything changed. The thing about traitors is that they are never who you expect. They are never the bitter, overlooked subordinate nursing a grudge in the corner. They are never the newcomer with suspicious eyes and a resume that doesn't quite add up. No, traitors, the truly dangerous variety, are always the ones who laugh the loudest at the boss's jokes. They are the ones who have been there the longest, trusted the deepest, handed the keys to every room, including the ones nobody is supposed to know exist. They are the ones whose loyalty has been so thoroughly assumed that questioning it feels almost offensive. Traders wear cufflinks and remember your coffee order and have been stealing from you for so long that the theft has started to feel like furniture. Park Sung-jin's cufflinks were platinum. Simone had noticed them on day 1. By day 11, she had a ghost file. Not an official one. Nothing submitted to Kang. Nothing documented in the syndicate system. Nothing that existed anywhere except in the encrypted folder on the secondary device she kept sewn into the lining of her go bag, which itself lived in a location in her room that she changed every 48 hours because paranoia, in her profession, was simply another word for professionalism. The ghost file on Park Sung-jin was 14 pages and growing. It contained, among other things, a timeline of the known intelligence leaks cross-referenced against Park's confirmed locations on each date, overlapping with a precision that was no longer coincidental. It was confessional. 3 photographs taken from a distance, using the compact lens she carried disguised as a pen, of Park's meetings with a man she did not yet have a name for. A heavy-set figure in civilian clothes who appeared near the compound twice in 10 days and disappeared both times into the foot traffic of Gangnam like smoke into wind. A record of Park's communication patterns, specifically the micropauses in his public behavior that corresponded, with metronomic regularity, to the moments immediately before Kang's security rotations were adjusted. And finally, most damningly, a napkin. It was a small thing, unremarkable. The kind of cocktail napkin that lived its entire life in the background of more important events. Park had passed it to the heavy-set civilian at the second meeting, folded into a square so neat it could only have been prepared in advance, and the civilian had slipped it into his breast pocket with the casual fluency of a man who had done this before, many times, in many rooms. Simone had not been close enough to read it. She didn't need to. The geometry of the exchange told her everything the content would have confirmed. The difficulty, and there was always a difficulty, because the universe was structurally opposed to anything being simple, was Kang himself. Convincing Kang Han-sol that his most trusted lieutenant was a traitor was going to be roughly equivalent to convincing the sun that it was cold, not because the evidence was insufficient. The evidence was, frankly, overwhelming. But Kang was a man whose empire was built on the foundation of his own judgment, and his judgment had decided 6 years ago that Park Sung-jin was loyal. To revise that decision now was not merely to admit he had been wrong about a person, it was to admit he had been wrong about himself, about his instincts, about the steel vault of a mind he had cultivated and weaponized and staked his entire survival upon. Men like Kang Han-sol would rather burn the house down than admit the fire started in their own kitchen. Simone understood this. She had worked for men like this before. She had, on at least 2 occasions, physically dragged men like this away from situations their pride had walked them directly into. And on both occasions, they had been furious with her for approximately 72 hours before the gratitude arrived, quiet and slightly embarrassed, like a guest who had shown up to the wrong party. She needed a different approach. She needed him to see it himself. The opportunity arrived, as opportunities in dangerous situations often do, wearing the disguise of an ordinary evening. Kang had a standing engagement every Wednesday, a private card game held in the uppermost floor of a building in Mapo-gu that technically belonged to a real estate holding company and actually belonged to the kind of arrangement that real estate holding companies were specifically invented to obscure. 6 players. High stakes. The kind of stakes where the money was almost secondary to the information exchanged across the felt, in the language of men who had decided long ago that laws were guidelines written by people who lacked imagination. Simone was positioned at the room's perimeter, back to the wall, equidistant from the 2 exits, watching hands. Park was dealing, and Park, for the first time in 11 days of careful observation, made a mistake. It was small, microscopic, the kind of mistake that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it, and invisible, crucially, to anyone who had decided in advance that Park Sung-jin was not worth watching carefully. He reached into his jacket pocket during a lull between hands, thumb moving across his phone screen in a gesture so brief it barely qualified as a gesture. And then the phone was gone, and his hands were back on the table, and his face was a mask of pleasant attention. 20 seconds later, Kang's personal security lead, a broad, quiet man named June, who handled the building's exterior, stepped away from his post to take a call. Simone clocked the 20-second gap with the cold arithmetic of someone who had been counting gaps professionally for a decade. She moved to the window, looked down. The street below, which had been clear on her last sweep 6 minutes ago, now contained a black van parked at an angle that blocked the secondary exit route. It had not been there 6 minutes ago. She turned back to the room. Park was laughing at something Kang had said. Warm, easy, 6 years of trust worn like a second skin. Simone made a decision. She crossed the room in 12 steps, which was 10 more than she preferred for this kind of conversation, and leaned down to Kang's left ear. Protocol dictated she whisper. Urgency dictated she be fast. Pride, her own carefully managed, dictated she choose words that would land without requiring him to publicly acknowledge he needed them. The exterior post just moved, she said in Korean. Quiet, flat. There is a vehicle at the secondary exit that wasn't there 6 minutes ago. I need you to stand up slowly, say goodnight, and walk to the private elevator without looking at the street. Kang's card hand didn't move. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A tectonic thing, deep and significant. The first crack in the absolute confidence of a man beginning to process the possibility that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had constructed it to be. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he set his cards face down on the table, pushed back his chair, and said to the room, in the easy tone of a man ending an evening on his own terms, Gentlemen, I believe that's enough for tonight. He did not look at the street. He did not look at Park. But Simone did. And what she saw on Park Sung-jin's face in the half-second before his professional mask reassembled itself was not confusion at the early ending. It was not disappointment. It was not the mild social adjustment of a loyal lieutenant whose boss had decided to call it a night. It was recalculation. The expression of a man whose plan had just encountered an unexpected variable. Simone filed it. Every detail, every micro-expression. The way his jaw tightened. The way his eyes moved. Not to Kang, but to the window. To the street he already knew contained a van he had already arranged. She smiled at him. Just barely. The knife-catching light smile. He looked away. Good, she thought. Be afraid of what you don't understand. I'll explain it to you shortly. In the elevator, descending in the private car that Simone had rerouted through the building's service exit before the evening began, a precaution she had taken without informing anyone, because precautions announced in advance were simply invitations to circumvent them. Kang stood very still. He did not thank her. He did not acknowledge in any explicit way that she had just navigated him out of a situation he hadn't seen coming. But as the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened to the waiting car, he paused. 1 beat. 2. The vehicle on the street, he said in Korean, without turning to look at her. How long had you been watching for it? Since day 1, Simone replied. I watch everything. Another pause. Longer. Then Kang Han-sol, the Ice King of the Northern Syndicates, the man who had described her as a decorative shield and a house cat in an American exhibit, walked to his car without another word. But he didn't call her the American exhibit again that night. It was, coming from him, practically a standing ovation. Chapter 4. Ice begins to crack. There is a specific moment in every power dynamic when the balance shifts. It doesn't announce itself. There is no dramatic musical swell, no lightning strike, no convenient pause in the weather to mark the occasion. It happens in the small, unspectacular spaces between words, in a silence that lasts 1 beat too long, in an eye contact held 1 second past its usual boundary, in the precise moment when a man who has never needed anyone quietly, privately, begins to need someone. Kang Han-sol would have rather swallowed his own platinum cufflinks than admit this out loud. But the ice, after 11 days of Simone Reed operating in his orbit with the calm, devastating competence of a woman who had been underestimated by better men than him and survived every single one of them, the ice was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to crack. Simone noticed. She noticed everything. She said nothing. She filed it under useful. The morning after the card game, something in the compound's atmosphere had shifted in the subtle but unmistakable way of weather systems, invisible to the casual observer, legible to anyone who had learned to read pressure. Kang's first meeting began at 7, as always. His lieutenants filed in with their usual choreography of suits and composure, and the specific brand of performative alertness that men display when they are trying to look like they have not been doing whatever they were just doing. Park Sung-jin arrived third, as he always did, taking his seat to Kang's left with 6 years of practiced ease. Simone stood at the room's perimeter, 2 paces behind Kang's right shoulder. Her position, her geometry. Kang opened the meeting without preamble, as always. Operational updates, territory reports. The week's financials summarized in the clipped, efficient language of men who had long since stopped being surprised by large numbers. And then, so briefly that 3 of the 7 lieutenants missed it entirely, Kang's eyes moved to Park's hands. Just for a moment. One glance, controlled and expressionless, that dropped to Park's left hand resting on the table, and then returned to the papers in front of him without any change in his face whatsoever. He had been watching hands. Simone had to work to keep the satisfaction off her face. There it is, she thought. The seed lands. She found him in the East Wing gym at 5:40 that morning, earlier than usual, which told her the card game had cost him sleep, which told her the crack in the ice was deeper than his face was willing to show. He was working a heavy bag with the methodical, controlled fury of a man processing something he refused to process any other way, each strike precise and economical. The kind of training that was less about fitness and more about thinking through the body when the mind had run out of clean surfaces to think on. Simone stretched in the corner, said nothing, watched the bag. He threw 43 strikes before he spoke. She counted. "You moved the car last night," he said. "Not a question. The service exit route. I didn't authorize that." "No," she agreed. "You didn't inform me." "Also no. In my organization," Kang said, landing a particularly deliberate strike, "people who make unauthorized decisions about my security don't typically remain in their positions." "In your organization?" Simone replied, stretching her left shoulder with complete composure. "People who remain in their positions typically survive. I'm trying to maintain your record. 37 predecessors is already an uncomfortable number." The bag swung. Kang caught it with both hands, stilling it, and turned to look at her with an expression that was doing considerable architectural work, holding several things simultaneously, none of which he intended to let through the facade. "The vehicle," he said finally. "You knew it would be there. I suspected. I prepared. That's the job." "Who told you to suspect?" Simone looked at him steadily. "Nobody tells me anything, Mr. Kang. That's why I'm still standing here, and number 37 communicates exclusively on Tuesdays." Something moved across his face. Not amusement, not quite, but the distant cousin of it. The expression of a man encountering a response he had not preloaded a counter for and finding the experience, against his will, mildly interesting. He returned to the bag. She returned to her stretching. They occupied the same room in a silence that had changed its quality entirely from the silences of the previous 11 days. Before, the silence had been his weapon, the deliberate, crushing quiet of a man, using absence of acknowledgement as a tool of diminishment. Now the silence was something else, something more like two people thinking in proximity, which was an entirely different and considerably more dangerous thing. The CTA lives here, right in the gut of Chapter 4, where the villain's mask begins to slip. Because here's the thing about Kang Han-sol that his lieutenants never understood, that his rivals consistently underestimated, and that Park Sung-jin, God help him, had catastrophically failed to account for. Beneath the contempt, beneath the archaic Korean insults and the decorative shield commentary and the 37 departures and the immaculate Instagram philanthropy, Kang was not stupid. He was, in fact, terrifyingly intelligent. He had simply made the oldest mistake available to terrifyingly intelligent people. He had confused familiarity with knowledge. He knew his world. He knew his language. He knew the 47 ways a man's face could lie and the 3 ways it couldn't. He knew silk from polyester at 20 feet and loyalty from performance at considerably closer range, or so he had believed. Park had been performing for 6 years, and Kang, who prided himself on reading everything, had been reading the performance and calling it the truth. Does that sound familiar? Someone in your life, someone trusted, someone close, someone whose loyalty you have never thought to question, performing so well that the performance became invisible? Hit the like button if you've ever trusted someone who was smiling at you and texting your enemy at the same time. Subscribe, because what Simone does with this information will make every betrayal you've ever survived feel like it had a point. Don't side with Park. Don't be Park. It was at 11:43 that morning that Kang did something unprecedented. He asked for her assessment. Not publicly. Not in the presence of the lieutenants. Not with the architecture of professional consultation that would have required him to perform the asking as much as mean it. He did it in the 30 seconds between the end of the morning meeting and the beginning of his first external call, in the corridor outside the briefing room, in a voice so low and controlled it was practically underground. "The security rotation," he said, walking without slowing. "You have observations." It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as the closest a man like Kang Han-sol could get to "please help me" without his mouth actually forming those words, which, physiologically, it appeared structurally incapable of doing. Simone fell into step beside him, not 2 paces behind, beside, and spoke in Korean, quietly and precisely, because this was not a conversation for English. "Your rotation follows a 72-hour cycle," she said. "Predictable at the macro level, varied at the micro. Whoever is feeding information to the Southern Collective doesn't need to know the specific pattern. They only need to know the cycle length. From there, any competent operative can calculate the windows." Kang walked, listened. His face was a closed book in a locked room. "You'd want to introduce a false rotation," Simone continued. "Something that looks like your standard cycle but runs on a different clock. Whoever is leaking will feed the false pattern south. When Bake's people move on that information and find the windows closed, you'll know the channel is active. And you'll know approximately when the last transmission occurred, which narrows your list considerably." Silence. 8 steps. 10. "You've done this before," Kang said. "I've done most things before," Simone replied. "That's why Theo said the number and I got on the plane." Another silence, different from all the previous ones. This one had the quality of a man standing at the edge of a decision, looking down, calculating the drop. They reached the end of the corridor. Kang stopped. He turned, and for the first time since she had arrived in Seoul, he looked at her, not with assessment, not with the detached appraisal of a man examining furniture, not with the lazy contempt of someone testing a decorative shield, but with the precise, level attention of one dangerous professional recognizing another. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked into his office, and the door closed behind him with a soft, expensive click. But before it closed, just before, in the half-second gap between the door and the frame, he said, in Korean, without looking back, "Implemented." 2 words, in her language. Simone stood in the corridor, alone, and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of the expression that she kept off her face in every professional setting. The quiet, deep, bone-level satisfaction of a woman who had walked into a lion's den and had just been handed the keys. Then she straightened, reset her face, turned toward the next task. The trap was being built. Now she needed the rat to step into it. Chapter 4. End. Awaiting your approval before I proceed to Chapter 5. There is an art to building a trap for a clever man. A simple trap, the blunt, mechanical variety, works perfectly well on simple people. You put the cheese on the plate, you step back, you wait. Simple people see the cheese and think about cheese. They do not think about the plate. They certainly do not think about you, standing in the corner, watching. Simple people make simple mistakes, and simple mistakes are easy to catch and easy to prosecute, and frankly, a little boring. But a clever man, a man who has survived 6 years inside one of Seoul's most dangerous organizations by being precisely clever enough to steal without appearing to steal, to betray without appearing to betray, to smile at the face of the man he was systematically dismantling, and make that smile look like devotion. A clever man requires a different kind of trap entirely. He requires a trap that looks like luck. Simone had built exactly that. And it was, even by her own exacting standards, some of her finest work. The false rotation had been implemented on a Wednesday. She had walked Kang through it in the same corridor, same low voice, same practiced efficiency. A modified security cycle that appeared to follow the standard 72-hour pattern, but actually operated on a 58-hour clock, with 3 manufactured windows of apparent vulnerability strategically placed like stage props in a theater production designed for an audience of 1. Kang had listened, approved, issued the adjustments through his security lead June, who was one of 4 people in the compound Simone had quietly cleared of suspicion through the Ghost Files process of elimination, not because she trusted him completely, But because his behavioral profile was clean, his communication patterns were transparent, and his hands, blessedly, were always still. Park had been present for the rotation briefing. Naturally, he was always present. 6 years had purchased him a seat at every table, access to every room, a front row position for every strategic conversation, all of which he had been converting with remarkable consistency into currency for the Southern Collective. Simone had watched his hands during the briefing. The left thumb. Slow circles. 3 times in 12 minutes. There you are, she thought pleasantly. Received and transmitted. Right on schedule. The waiting was the hardest part for most people. For Simone, waiting was simply another form of working. She used it the way a surgeon uses the hours before an operation, not to rest, but to rehearse. She walked the building's perimeter at irregular intervals, mapping the small changes in Seoul's ambient geography that signaled preparation. A delivery vehicle that parked too long, a pedestrian who circled the same block twice, a restaurant that had been open for 6 months suddenly and inexplicably closed for renovation on a Thursday with no signage. The Southern Collective, she had come to understand, operated with a precision that was almost admirable and entirely lethal. Bake, the man with the patience of geology and the moral compass of a parking ticket, did not move impulsively. He built. He constructed. He laid groundwork the way architects laid foundations, methodically and deep. And by the time the structure above was visible, the foundations were already immovable. He was, in the language of Simone's profession, a serious problem, which made dismantling him, she had to admit, considerably more interesting than her last 3 contracts combined. On the 3rd day after the false rotations implementation, the first confirmation arrived. Simone was in the compound's surveillance room, a space she had quietly made herself indispensable in by the straightforward method of being better at reading its feeds than anyone else present. When a flag hit her secondary device, the contact she had reactivated at Seoul's National Intelligence Service, a woman named Agent Yu, who had the energy of someone who survived entirely on green tea and righteous indignation, had been monitoring Southern Collective communication channels as a professional courtesy that was not entirely professional. The flag was a single encrypted message, intercepted and partially decoded. 3 words survived the decryption intact. Window confirmed. Thursday. Simone looked at the timestamp, looked at the false rotation schedule, looked at the manufactured vulnerability window she had planted specifically at Thursday's second shift change. She exhaled through her nose. Then she picked up her phone and sent Kang 2 words. It's Park. She set the phone down and waited. The response came in 47 seconds, which was, for Kang Han-sol, the communicative equivalent of running into the room screaming. Come to the office, now. She found him standing at his window, the first time she had ever seen him standing rather than seated in that room, which told her everything about the state of the ice beneath his composed exterior. Seoul spread below him in its gleaming, indifferent sprawl, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the ground he had been standing on for 6 years was not ground at all. It was a painting of ground. Very convincing, very detailed. But paint, ultimately, was paint. He turned when she entered. His face was doing the architectural work again, holding everything in, distributing the weight evenly, refusing to let any single beam buckle. But his eyes, the steel vault eyes that had cataloged and dismissed her on day 1, were doing something she had not seen them do before. They were asking for help, not in words, not explicitly. Kang Han-sol asking for help explicitly was an event roughly as likely as the Han River flowing uphill, but in the precise, contained way of a man who had run every available calculation and arrived finally at the conclusion that one resource in his possession was significantly more valuable than he had originally assessed. He was asking. Simone crossed the room and placed the ghost file on his desk. Not a summary, not a briefing. The full 14 pages of meticulous, cross-referenced, timestamp-verified documentation that she had been building since day 3 in the sewn lining of her go-bag. Kang looked at it. He did not touch it immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something that is going to change everything the moment you pick it up, and you need one last second in the world where you haven't picked it up yet. Then he picked it up. He read in silence. Simone stood and watched Seoul through his window and gave him the privacy of his own reckoning, because some things needed to be processed without an audience, and she had enough professional courtesy to understand which moments those were. He read for 11 minutes. She counted. When he set the file down, His hands were flat on the desk, still, deliberate. The hands of a man using every available mechanism of self-control to remain in his body while his mind processed a 6-year betrayal by the person he had trusted most. "How long have you known?" he asked. His voice was level, glacially, impressively, terrifyingly level. "Confirmed, 3 days ago. Suspected, since day 3. Day 3, he repeated. Something moved behind his eyes. "You've been building this since day 3. "I told you," Simone said, turning from the window to face him. "I watch everything." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. It had weight and shape, and the specific, pressurized quality of a silence that is holding back something enormous. Grief, maybe, or fury, or the particular species of cold that moves in when you realize that warmth you trusted was manufactured. Then Kang Han's soul straightened. The ice reformed. Not the same ice. Something harder, and underneath it, something different from before. Something that had not been there in the gymnasium or the corridor or the briefing room. Respect. Clean, uncomplicated, professionally rendered respect. The kind that has no room in it for condescension or exoticism or decorative shields or American exhibits. The kind that one dangerous person extends to another dangerous person when the evidence has become too overwhelming to dress up as anything else. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she confirmed. "You'll need access to the full security apparatus, authorization codes, exterior and interior command." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment that had the quality of a door opening. "You have them," he said. Simone left the office and walked down the corridor and into the surveillance room, and sat down in front of the feeds and began preparing Thursday's operation with the quiet, focused energy of a woman who had been waiting for this moment since a Thursday in New York that smelled like rain and bad decisions. Park Sung-jin was 3 floors away, drinking his afternoon coffee, laughing at something on his phone, utterly unaware that the trap he had walked into had teeth. Very specifically, it had her teeth, and they were exceptional. Outside, Seoul hummed, the neon would come later. The confrontation would come Thursday. And somewhere in a building across the city, a man named Beck with the patience of geology was about to discover that geology, impressive as it was, had never once survived a controlled detonation. Simone Reed had the detonator. She was simply waiting for Thursday. Thursday arrived the way all consequential days arrive. Quietly, unremarkably, with the same gray soul morning light filtering through the compound's floor-to-ceiling windows, the same 5:15 alarm, the same ritual of coffee and surveillance feeds, and the compound stirring itself awake with its usual choreography of suits and sidelong glances, and men who believed, with the comfortable confidence of people who had never been genuinely surprised, that they understood exactly what kind of day this was going to be. They did not. This was going to be the kind of day that divided everything into before and after. The kind that rewrote the organizational chart and settled old debts and proved, with the finality of a closed door, that the most dangerous person in any room was almost never the person everyone was watching. It was always the person watching everyone else. Simone had not slept. Not because she couldn't. She had slept 4 hours in worse conditions than a well-appointed Seoul compound, had once caught 90 minutes on a military transport over the Atlantic during a thunderstorm that had rearranged the overhead luggage and the faith of every passenger aboard. Sleep was not the issue. The issue was that Thursday required a particular state of mind that sleep would have interrupted, a high, clean alertness, every sense calibrated to its outermost edge, the mental equivalent of a blade that has been sharpened past the point of necessity into the territory of intention. She had spent the pre-dawn hours running final checks. The false rotation window opened at 1400 hours, 2 in the afternoon, when the second shift change created a manufactured gap in the exterior coverage of the compound's eastern service entrance. It was the window she had built specifically to be irresistible. Not too obvious, not too clean. Calibrated at exactly the level of vulnerability that a competent operative feeding intelligence south would recognize as genuine, without stopping to question whether it had been designed to be recognized. Park had transmitted the window. The Southern Collective had confirmed receipt. Agent Yu's intercepted fragment had verified activation. Bake's people would move through the eastern service entrance at 1400 hours. They would find it covered, not by the rotation they expected. not by the pattern they had mapped. By Simone's reconfigured deployment, 12 men repositioned in the preceding 4 hours under the cover of routine maintenance activity, occupying angles that the Southern Collective's surveillance could not see from the street, in a containment formation that owed more to her special forces training than to anything in the syndicate's standard playbook. And at the center of it all, handling the interior, specifically the interior question of Park Sung-jin, would be Simone herself. The morning meeting proceeded as normal. This was essential. Any deviation from the established rhythm would register on Park's internal seismograph, the finely tuned instrument of a man who had survived 6 years of high-stakes deception by being exquisitely sensitive to changes in atmospheric pressure. He needed to walk into Thursday believing it was Wednesday. He needed his coffee and his seat to Kang's left, and his 6 years of manufactured loyalty sitting around him like armor, undisturbed. Kang was extraordinary. Simone would give him that, freely and without qualification. The man was an actor of the first order. He sat through the morning meeting with his characteristic economy of expression, reviewed the week's operational updates with his standard clipped attention, made 2 observations, and asked 3 questions, and gave Park Sung-jin precisely the same quality of eye contact he had given him every morning for 6 years. Not a degree warmer, not a degree colder. Simone, standing at her perimeter position, watched Park receive this normalcy and visibly, microscopically relax into it, his left thumb stilling against his thigh in the way it only stilled when he had assessed the room and found it safe. She watched him decide that today was just another day. The cruelty of it, she thought, was almost elegant. At 1300 hours, Kang called a private lunch. This was unusual. Kang ate alone, as a rule, his solitary table set for 8 being one of the compound's more quietly melancholy traditions. A private lunch with his bodyguard was unprecedented, and she could feel the compound's attention shift slightly as she followed him to the small dining room adjacent to his office. The way a room full of people tries not to visibly track something it has decided it isn't watching. The lunch was simple, quiet. 2 people eating across a table that knew how to keep secrets. Kang ate for 3 minutes before he spoke. After today, he said, without preamble, the organization will need restructuring. Yes, Simone agreed. The Southern Collective will regroup. Baek doesn't stop because one operation fails. No, but he stops being invisible. An exposed strategy is a dead strategy. You'll have the initiative. Kang considered this. Set down his chopsticks with the precise care of a man for whom even small gestures were deliberate. 6 years, he said. Not to her exactly. To the space between them, where the acknowledgement of a 6-year betrayal lived, too large and too heavy to be addressed directly. I built him. I gave him everything he used against me. Simone looked at him steadily. That's not a weakness, she said. That's what loyalty looks like from the inside. You can't perform loyalty that convincingly without being given something real to perform with. Park exploited your trust. That's his crime, not your error. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences, softer at the edges and more honest in its center. The kind of silence that exists between people who have stopped performing and started simply occupying the same space truthfully. Kang looked at her, not the assessment look, not the recalibration look, not even the respect look from the office, though that was present too, underneath. Something quieter, something that lived below the ice entirely and was perhaps, in a man like Kang Han's soul, considerably more significant for its rarity. He picked up his chopsticks and returned to his food. Don't let any of them through the east entrance, he said. Not a single one, Simone replied. 1400 hours arrived with the punctuality of consequence. Simone was at the eastern service entrance 40 minutes early, positioned in the maintenance corridor that ran parallel to it. Her 12 repositioned men deployed in the configuration she had mapped on paper 3 days ago and refined in her head every hour since. She was in communication with June through a single earpiece, running on a frequency she had changed that morning specifically for today, because old frequencies were old vulnerabilities, and she did not do old vulnerabilities. At 1358, June's voice arrived in her ear. 4 vehicles. Eastern approach. Civilian plates. Hold positions, Simone said. Let them commit to the entrance. 30 seconds. They're moving to the door. Hold. 15 seconds. The service entrance opened, not forced, opened, with a key that had been copied from a duplicate that should not have existed, but did, because Park Sung-jin had been thorough in his treachery, and Beck had been thorough in his preparation, and the first figure stepped through. "Now," Simone said. What happened next took 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and was, from a tactical perspective, so clean and complete that Agent Yu, reviewing the footage 3 days later, would describe it in her official notes as disproportionately efficient, which was the closest the National Intelligence Service's reporting style came to a standing ovation. 9 of Baek's operatives were contained at the entrance. 2 attempted to retreat and were collected at the perimeter. The 11th, a senior figure whose face matched a photograph in Simone's ghost file, was detained personally, efficiently, and with a minimum of ceremony in the corridor outside the service door. The 12th vehicle never arrived. It had been rerouted by Agent Yu's team 6 blocks away, which was a professional courtesy Simone intended to repay at the earliest opportunity. Upstairs, in the briefing room, Park Sung-jin was mid-sentence in an afternoon operational review when Kang's hand rose, one gesture, flat and final, and the room went silent. Kang looked at Park, really looked at him. The full weight of the steel vault, open now, not to catalog or assess, but to settle. "Sit down, Sung-jin," he said, very quietly. Park sat. His left thumb began its circles. "The eastern entrance," Kang said, "has been covered since this morning." He slid a single page across the table. The Ghost Files timeline, printed and precise. "Ms. Reed would like you to review her documentation." The color left Park's face in the specific, terrible way of a man watching the exit doors close one by one until there are no exit doors left, only the room and the table and the 6 years of manufactured loyalty dissolving like paper in water. His left thumb stopped. For the first time in 11 days of watching, it simply stopped. Simone stepped into the room then, from the corridor, and stood in her position. 2 paces behind Kang's right shoulder, back to the wall, equidistant from the exits, and looked at Park Sung-jin with an expression that was not triumph, not contempt, not the theatrical satisfaction of a dramatic reveal. It was simply completion. The expression of a woman who had seen the board on day 1, played every piece correctly, and was now watching the last move resolve exactly as calculated. Park looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time, past the American exhibit, past the decorative shield, past every comfortable assumption he had assembled around her like a second wall of defense. He saw what was actually there, and the expression that crossed his face. There is a moment in the aftermath of every war when the guns go quiet and the smoke begins to clear, and the people still standing look at each other across the wreckage and understand, with the particular clarity that only survival produces, that everything is different now. Not just the landscape, not just the organizational chart, or the security rotation, or the names on the doors of the briefing rooms. Everything. The architecture of power, the geometry of trust, the precise, molecular composition of who owes what, to whom, and in what currency, and across what distance. Everything. Park Sung-jin was escorted from the building at 1700 hours with the quiet efficiency of an organization that had long since perfected the art of making problems disappear without disturbing the ambient noise level. He left without his cufflinks, platinum, both of them, sitting on Kang's desk like a small monument to the specific hubris of men who believe expensive accessories constitute armor. He did not look back. Simone watched him go from the corridor window and felt nothing dramatic about it. No triumph, no residual fury. Just the clean, closing feeling of a chapter ending. The professional satisfaction of a problem correctly identified, correctly handled, correctly resolved. She had not come to Seoul for Park Sung-jin. She had come for the job. Park was simply what the job contained. She turned from the window and went back to work. The casino lounge on the night that changed everything was not on Simone's schedule. It was on Kang's, which at this stage of their arrangement amounted to the same thing, but the distinction mattered to her professionally because she had learned, across 3 continents in 11 years of protection work, that the events most likely to require her specific set of skills were always the ones that arrived unannounced on someone else's calendar. 3 days after Thursday, 3 days after the Eastern entrance, and the ghost file, and the platinum cufflinks, and Park's left thumb, finally, definitively going still, Kang received an invitation, not a request, an invitation, delivered through channels that communicated very precisely the difference. to attend a gathering in the private lounge of Gangnam's most exclusive underground casino. The gathering was ostensibly a celebration, a quarterly convening of the Northern Syndicate's senior figures, framed as a show of strength and solidarity in the wake of what had been publicly characterized within the organization's internal communications as a security adjustment. It was not a celebration. Simone read the invitation's subtext the way she read everything, completely and several layers below the surface, and understood it for what it was: a test. The senior figures wanted to see Kang, wanted to take the temperature of the Ice King post-betrayal, post-restructuring, in the room where rooms like this were decided, and determine whether the Northern Syndicates were still what they had been under his command, or whether the six-year mole had hollowed out the center in ways that a Thursday operation could not entirely repair. They wanted to see if he was still standing. They also, Simone noted with the flat professional attention she gave to all threats regardless of their social dressing, wanted to see her. Word had moved through the organization the way water moves through rock, slowly, invisibly, and with an erosive effect on every surface it touched. The American exhibit had built a ghost file. The American exhibit had reconfigured the security rotation. The American exhibit had personally overseen the containment of 11 Southern collective operatives with an efficiency that June had described to 3 separate people as not entirely human, and I mean that as a compliment. They wanted to see the American exhibit. Simone found this useful. The lounge was everything Seoul's underground money could construct and good taste could not entirely redeem. All dark wood and low lighting, and the expensive tobacco scent that seemed to be piped through the ventilation system of every room where powerful men conducted business they would prefer not to have documented. Kang's arrival was received with the careful, calibrated deference of men who respected power and were currently reassessing its precise location. Simone walked 2 paces behind his right shoulder, back straight, eyes conducting their perpetual inventory of exits and angles and hands, while the room adjusted itself around their entrance, the way rooms do when something has changed and everyone has agreed, wordlessly, not to be the first to name it. The senior figures were seated around a central table. 7 men, older than the lieutenants, heavier with the specific gravity of people who had made enough consequential decisions that consequence had become their natural atmosphere. They looked at Kang. They looked at Simone. She watched their hands. It began, as these things always began with Kang, as a performance. He settled into his chair with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life needed to establish his comfort in a room because he had long since decided that every room he entered was already his. He accepted a glass of whiskey from the server, the same unhurried gesture, the same precise grip, and surveyed his senior figures with the steel vault eyes and the controlled half-attention of a man listening to several conversations simultaneously, including the ones nobody was having out loud. And then he began to speak, in the archaic dialect, the elite register, the verbal velvet rope. But this time, and Simone understood this immediately, reading the shift in the room's atmosphere with the sensitivity of someone who had been calibrated to this particular frequency for weeks, he was not speaking to humiliate. He was performing for the senior figures, demonstrating the unchanged, undiminished command of a man who had survived betrayal from his innermost circle and emerged, not weakened, but refined. Still the Ice King, still in command of every register of power, still occupying his world with the absolute fluency of someone who had never once been made to feel like a stranger in it. The Northern Syndicates, he said, his voice the low, melodic growl that filled rooms without raising itself, have always survived through precision, not through sentiment, not through assumption, through the ability to see clearly what others prefer to leave comfortable and unexamined. The senior figures nodded. The room leaned in. We had a weakness, King continued, a calculated, long-term, sophisticated weakness that was introduced at the highest level of trust and operated there, invisibly, for 6 years. He paused, took a slow sip of his whiskey. It was found, it was documented, it was removed. And it was found not by the organization's existing apparatus, which, I will note, did not find it across 6 years of operation, but by an outside perspective, a different set of eyes, a fundamentally different understanding of what loyalty looks like when it's performing versus when it's real. The room was very still. Kang set his glass down. Ms. Reed, he said. And he said it in English, clean, deliberate, unambiguous English, in a room full of men who had gathered to assess whether the Ice King was still standing, and who now understood, with the clarity of a statement that required no translation, exactly what standing looked like. Simone stepped forward from her perimeter position. She felt the room's attention move to her. All of it. The full, concentrated weight of 7 senior figures recalibrating everything they had filed under American Exhibit and Decorative Shield and Foreign Curiosity in the weeks since her arrival. She let them look. Then one of the senior figures, the eldest, a man with the weathered stillness of someone who had outlasted everyone who had ever underestimated him, spoke. In the archaic dialect, precise and deliberate. "She is an outsider," he said. "She does not know our world. She cannot understand what she guards." The room waited. Simone looked at him, at the room, at the 7 senior figures and the whiskey glasses and the expensive tobacco haze and the dark wood walls of a room that had hosted 100 conversations about power and had perhaps never once hosted one that ended like this. Then she spoke. Her Korean arrived in the room like a blade through silk, clean and total, and carrying in its precision the weight of 3 years of Special Forces embedding and 11 years of professional survival and every archaic, elite, carefully aimed insult that had been directed at her in this city and every city before it by every man who had confused her composure for vacancy and her silence for ignorance. "The outsider," she said, in the dialect they had chosen specifically to exclude her, "found your inside man, built the case in 14 pages, while your inside apparatus found nothing across 6 years, reconfigured your security before your security knew it needed reconfiguring, and stood in this room while you discussed her as though she were furniture, which, respectfully, is exactly the kind of thinking that gave Park Sung-jin 6 uninterrupted years to dismantle you." The silence was geological. "I don't need to be from your world," she continued, her voice dropping to the register that carried furthest in very quiet rooms. "I need to be better at protecting it than anyone else you can afford, which I am. The documentation is available on request." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The eldest senior figure looked at her for a long, assessing moment. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a man making a decision he intended to stand behind, he inclined his head. Not a bow. Something more precise. The acknowledgement of one person who had earned a room to another person who had also earned it. Kang Han-sol watched this from his chair, and Simone, returning to her position, 2 paces behind his right shoulder, back to